Welcome back to my three-part lecture in which I talk about what is science. If you missed the first two parts, go ahead and check them out. In part one, I talked about the process of making observations and the process of generalizing those observations. In part two, I talked about theories and making predictions. And in this lecture, part three, I'll be talking about how scientists really work. First, I'd like to review the wheel of science. It is a general model describing the scientific method whereby scientists make observations and describe those observations to find general patterns. Those generalized patterns then form the basis of theories, which can serve as a foundation of making predictions about phenomena. And then those predictions are supported or not supported by making observations. This is a cyclic process with fairly discrete steps. Is this really how scientists go about their work? Well, according to Reiff, Harwood, and Phillipson, a significant challenge to providing students with the opportunity to model how scientists do science is the persistent description of the scientific method. Recent criticism of the traditional scientific method model asserts that it is not reflective of how real science is accomplished. The famous psychologist and behaviorist B.F. Skinner expressed a similar sentiment. He said that it is a mistake to identify scientific practice with the formalized constructions of statistics and scientific method. These disciplines have their place, but it does not coincide with the place of scientific research. They offer a method of science, but not, as is so often implied, the method. So, what is missing from the wheel of science? What is missing from this common representation of the scientific method? Well, I've asked my students this question on a couple occasions. How did science begin? And I think by talking about such questions, one can get insights about the nature of science. I've asked them this question, and to keep things simple, I gave them 4 response options. So, science began when someone had a theory. And, about 15% of my students picked that one, and that makes sense. You need to have some idea about how phenomena are related before you're going to go about studying them. Okay, science began when someone conducted a study. Not nearly as many of my students agreed with that one, only about 6%, and that makes sense. If you're going to conduct a study, you probably have research questions or hypotheses. There was some groundwork that occurred beforehand. It wasn't the starting point. Next, how did science begin? Someone made an observation. Now, nearly half of my students picked this one. And this isn't surprising. If you go back to part 1 of this lecture series, I begin my discussion of the wheel of science by talking about observation. Observation isn't the start or the finish of science necessarily, but it is a useful place to begin a discussion about science. So why would observations lead somebody down the path of science? Well, maybe it's because someone was curious, and actually about 1/3 of my students picked that one. And that's quite insightful. If you think about science, science is a process of inquiry. Being curious and asking questions are essential to how science is conducted. So if you look at the wheel of science, it makes a lot of sense to put questions at the hub. And these questions drive the other processes. So let's talk about questions. There was a study conducted by Reiff, Harwood, and Phillipson. They conducted interviews with 52 scientists from a diversity of fields, and they asked them a number of questions. There were a few key questions. They asked them, what is scientific inquiry? What are some characteristics of scientific inquiry? And can you think of an experience that involves scientific inquiry? And after conducting these interviews, they analyzed the transcripts and identified themes in what the interviewees said about scientific inquiry. One of the common themes had to do with questions. One of the participants in the study, a geologist, said, "Every time when you ask a question, it should lead you to another question, which ultimately creates knowledge. Questions provide the transition that has to be made as you build your knowledge." So questions serve as bridges among the processes of conducting science. They guide science. So let's go back to this wheel with questions in the middle and reconfigure it a little bit. So rather than a wheel of science, I'm going to share with you the wheel of inquiry, which came about after analyzing those interview transcripts. And to simplify this representation, I'm going to portray questions simply as a question mark in a circle, and then I'm going to shrink the wheel to make room for other nodes. This wheel of inquiry has a lot in common with the wheel of science in that it contains processes that scientists conduct in their work. Certainly, as with the wheel of science, observations are important. But questions about those observations are also important because by asking questions about what we see, we can recognize that there are challenges and problems, which we can define, and that creates a framework to move forward with scientific research. Of course, asking questions about an observed problem or challenge can lead a scientist to formulating formal research questions. What would they like to know about that challenge or problem? And once they've articulated a particular question, well, what is already understood about that phenomenon? And so they can go about investigating what is already known about that issue, about that phenomenon, by conducting some sort of literature search. After they've familiarized themselves with what is already known, they can articulate expectations, form predictions about what is not known. And based on the questions or hypotheses they pose, which they would like to test, they can generate ideas for how to conduct a study. The study could involve an experiment, it could involve a survey, it could involve interviews, as was the case in developing this wheel of inquiry. There are many ways of conducting a study to answer research questions or to test hypotheses, and questions about how that study was conducted will lead scientists to a particular method of interpreting the data, analyzing the data. And the results of the data and questions about what that means will lead to some sort of interpretation on a more abstract level, reflecting on the findings, which of course need to be reported and shared, not only with the scientific community, but to society as it is relevant. And so this wheel of inquiry is similar to the wheel of science in that there are processes surrounding the wheel, and scientists go through these processes in conducting their work. But unlike the wheel of science, the wheel of inquiry isn't cyclical. It's not that scientists go through these steps in a clockwise fashion and do so repeatedly, but rather that as they move from one step to another, they ask questions that reference some of the earlier steps and give them insights about how to proceed. So, for example, how a scientist interprets the results certainly requires that they have carried out the study. There is a sequence to that process. They do the study, then they analyze the data, but how they analyze the data probably refers to some of the earlier steps. For example, what is the specific problem they are studying? What is the research question they articulated early on? How have prior researchers analyzed similar studies? And this process of inquiry is therefore self-referential, it is recursive, and it is not the cycle that the wheel of science portrays science to be. And so we go back to this question, how did science begin? And a couple of the interviewees, the scientists who were interviewed in this study, had some insightful observations. For example, one of them said that observational skills are a part of the key. Many people look, but they do not see. The fundamental skill for starting the inquiry process is to look and see. So the inquiry process begins with observation, but not simply observation. It's looking and understanding the relevance and value of what is seen, the relevance and value to science. And of course, that relevance and value refers to theory, refers to prior work. And again, looking and seeing fits into this wheel of inquiry on a deeper level. Another scientist said that too many people think science is collecting data in the lab. What I tell my students is that science begins after you have collected the data. And this makes a lot of sense as well. The value of data comes from the analysis and the insights, and those insights have value only insofar as they link with existing knowledge and expand that existing knowledge. And so again, it's not the process of collecting data and analyzing the data and then relating it back to theory, but finding the relevance of the data and of the analysis by looking at prior theory and asking these recursive questions within the wheel of inquiry. And so how did science begin? Well, it didn't really begin anywhere. It is a continuous process that goes through many different nodes in a wheel of inquiry. And yeah, that's how scientists conduct science. Of course, that model is not complete. You could speak to some scientists who see themselves fitting only into a portion of the model, or they might describe even steps in their own research that don't quite fit within the model. And so this wheel of inquiry is a nice general description of how a lot of scientists conduct their work. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you've learned about an additional way of thinking about the scientific method. If you'd like to see the research cited in this video, the link is in the description. Thanks for watching.